Welcome to Financial Repression Authority's Roundtable Insight, where the best fund managers, economists, and industry leaders discuss the key investment issues and challenges in the current macroeconomic environment.
Hi, welcome to FRA's Roundtable Insight. This is Richard Bernoulli. Today we have Charles Hugh Smith, author, leading global finance blogger, and America's philosopher. He's the author of 9 books on our economy and society, including A Radically Beneficial World, Automation, Technology, and Creating Jobs for All, Resistance, Revolution, Liberation, A Model for Positive Change, and The Nearly Free University in the Emerging Economy. His blog of twominds.com has logged well over 55 million page views and is number 7 on CNBC's top alternative finance site. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you, Richard. I hope I live up to that very nice introduction.
Oh, you always do. Yeah, thank you for being on the show. And so I think today we wanted to do a bit of a change and look at the economy as a whole and some very interesting trends that are happening, namely software automation, robotics, process automation, and artificial intelligence, and how that is changing the economy, the job market, how organizations are being affected by these changes, what are they doing, and if people cannot be redeployed elsewhere within an organization, what's the answer? Do we do a lunar Apollo crash program, or some of your thoughts on that? And just like to point out, so you've written a book, A Radically Beneficial World on Automation, Technology, and Creating Jobs. So that could be quite relevant here, and also a number of articles as well.
Right. Well, this is a fascinating topic to me, Richard, and so I've spent a lot of time trying to get up to speed on it. And of course, it's evolving so quickly that those of us that aren't really in the field, we're always just trying to play a little bit of catch up. So I'm not claiming to be cutting edge here, but I think I have thought a lot about it and tried to help my readers navigate it. So I guess I would start with what's the context of automation and robotics and AI, the impact on the economy as a whole. And I call it this whole sector trend change, the emerging economy, because it hasn't yet occupied every sector of the economy, but we know it will, right? So that's why I call it the emerging economy. We see it everywhere, but it hasn't yet. It's still quite a ways from fully manifesting in every sector of the economy. And one of the issues that you raise here is what happens if we can't employ people in a sustainable fashion at a relatively high rate of pay, then who's going to be supporting the consumer economy? Right? In other words, and then the basic answer for a lot of people is, well, we'll give everybody universal basic income, but that's like $1,000 per person per month is sort of the general gist of that. That's not the equivalent of a real a middle class job. That's just survival pay. So that's really not going to solve that issue. So that's one issue, and that's I think the impetus behind your questions. We really need people to be working, not only because we need their productive input and capacity, but we also have to give people a way to generate enough income to have a good life as prices continue to rise and so on.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, what's happening here is generally technology companies will be able to transform an organization or provide some assistance in the areas of software automation, robotics, process automation, and artificial intelligence. But what happens is, after some work through organizational change management, they're able to identify other areas of the organization where those affected by the job changes can be redeployed to elsewhere in the organization. But it doesn't work for everybody. Some cannot be redeployed elsewhere within the organization, and so they would be let go, and then it becomes a societal problem or a government problem at that point. So that's the big question. What happens at that point?
Right. And just to provide some context, I've assembled a few graphics here that will help us, I hope, contextualize your question. The first is the iPhone supply chain, which goes to show just how global the tech economy is. Now, of course, this is not the entire economy, right? Because as I read, somebody noted recently on the internet, you can't get a haircut, on the internet, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, so my point here with the iPhone supply chain is to show that automation is a global phenomenon, right? They're automating in China despite the lower labor costs, because the labor costs are rising there too. So it's not just an advanced economy problem. It's global. And my next chart here is labor share of the GDP. In other words, how much of the gross domestic product, the real economy, how much of that ends up in the hands of labor as opposed to in the hands of capital or other investment. And we can see from this chart that the labor share rose considerably in the dot-com era because there was a huge expansion of employment to build out the basic infrastructure of the internet. And so that created a lot of real employment. But when that got built out, then the labor share of the GDP plummeted, and it hasn't recovered despite the so-called global recovery. So my point here is to show that we really need to keep labor share of the GDP high enough to support consumption, or else the model of our economy no longer works. My next little chart here is the acceleration of technological adoption. And of course, we all feel this intuitively, but this points out that, it took like 26 years for television to become ubiquitous. And then it took like social media only 5 years.
Yeah.
And so this puts a lot of pressure on individuals and organizations, because we can see that this trend of automation is speeding up. It's accelerating. And so, it's almost like whatever skill you learned in college, if it's 4 years later, you're already behind the curve. It's like it requires like more or less constant learning because of this accelerating adoption rate. And although we're talking about the economy as a whole, I have a graphic here of the United States, which is an example of an advanced economy. You could call up a map of China or Japan or Europe, and have a similar discussion. But the so-called creative class, which is sort of a generalized term for people with higher education degrees, and experience in the emerging economy, these, of course, are clustered in certain areas. And so we're really talking about two separate economies. So when we try to answer your important question, what do we do with people who aren't able to transition to an emergent technology kind of economy? It's a regional thing too, because obviously the places like the San Francisco Bay Area and equivalent places are more have the human capital, if you will, to address these issues better than areas with a less educated, less mobile kind of employment foundation.
Yeah.
My next chart is it shows that this is in the healthcare sector in the United States, which we all know is troubled for a lot of reasons, and it shows that the number of physicians who've been added to the sector is minimal in the last 30 or 40 years, where the growth of administrators is up about 3,000%. And so I bring this chart to our attention as an example of a sector that's obviously ripe for disruption. And there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of work that can be automated or streamlined in sectors like healthcare. So in other words, this is not just high tech, like we're not talking about chip design or social media or mobile apps. We're looking at at the very large sectors that employ millions of people, which are ripe for disruption by the forces we're talking about here. And my last chart is distribution of income here, family income, which shows that, as we all know, the top 10% has basically lifted away from the bottom 90% in terms of income. And the reason why I bring this up is there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of them is that this top 10% is, of course, tends to be the most highly educated, the most dynamic sector of the population. And so they're the ones that are acquiring the skills and managerial skills to navigate the emerging economy. And so this is reflected in their much higher income. And this is the danger of what we're talking about here is, even if we can maintain some generalized employment, if most of the rewards are going to the top 10%, then that also calls into question our whole mass consumption model of our economy. Yeah. So now, having said all that, how are organizations being affected by this change, and how is it affecting the job market? And how do organizations take the initiative to redeploy or train resources affected by these? These are all excellent questions, and of course, it depends on the sector. Say, just to give a brief example, like say the construction industry, there's a certain amount of technological innovation there in terms of having components fabricated in a factory and then shipped and assembled on site to reduce labor. But there's a lot of, like, say, remodeling work. It's very hard to automate that kind of stuff because it's unique to each particular dwelling or each project, and we still need workers with multiple skill sets. So I think, as a general rule, what we want to train our people for, whether they're within our organization or if they're students or laid off workers, is we want to give people a menu of skill sets, not just a specialty. I mean, a specialty skill works great if you're designing really high-end chipsets or you're a physician. But for the rest of the populace, then specialization means that you can be replaced by automation a lot easier than if you have multiple skills. And so that's one issue here, that we want to broaden people's skill set. And the another thought here is that some labor is really hard to automate. And of course, that tends to be like creative work, design, editing, this kind of thing. But even those kinds of advanced skill sets are being automated too, as automation eats its way up the food chain. And so another sector of work that's fairly protected is managing people, managerial skills, which is really hard to automate. And also anything that, any kind of employment that's based on high touch, what's known as high touch, meaning that you are interacting with humans is what creates the value of your employment. And so, of course, this tends to be like nursing and childcare. And so I think what we're really talking about here when we talk about how do organizations respond, we're talking not about those professions that are very difficult to automate, but we're talking about the professions that have to work with automation. They may not be completely replaced, but it demands the employees augment the processes and learn enough to increase productivity, because that's another kind of thing we're talking about here. As technologies, as automation and AI, spread throughout the economy, we're finding productivity is still stagnating. So we're not really getting the gains of that. I mean, you must have some thoughts about that too, right? Because technology is supposed to enhance productivity. That's the wealth creation part.
Yeah, and I mean, you've also explored in recent writings as well how organizations are being affected by these changes. So, not only, as you just mentioned, on the productivity results, but also on profits. Can you elaborate on that? In recent writings, you mentioned that the automation doesn't just destroy jobs; it destroys profits too.
Right, and that's counterintuitive for a lot of people, Richard, because they assume that the robot, because it's replacing human labor, that it's cheaper, that it's going to generate huge profits for the company that replaced their, you know, their employees with robots. But it doesn't work like that, and the reason why is commoditization. When we commoditize something, whether it's labor or capital or goods, uh, it means that they're interchangeable and they can be produced anywhere in the world. And so this is what the globalization phenomenon has why it's reduced costs so much is labor is interchangeable. Computer chips are interchangeable. Computer design centers are interchangeable, and so a robot is like a good example of a commoditized tool. In other words, anybody can buy the same robot that I bought, and they can put it on their line. So therefore, where's my scarcity value? Where's my competitive edge? And so as soon as you get robots involved, then profits fall because everything becomes a commodity. And we can see this in technology, that when something is commoditized, the value drops, the price drops, and the profit margins drop to near zero. Like, for instance, a tablet. Right now, if you have the special software that Apple sells, right, it's tightly bound to its hardware. That's their scarcity value. You can only get the certain features that with Apple by spending $400 on an iPad, right? But if you're going to get a generic tablet, those are like $30 a piece in China with free software loaded, right? And they have 80 or 90% of the capability of the more expensive one. So that's the same thing that's going to happen to robotics. You know, everybody can buy the same robotics, and a lot of the tools of automation are free. They're software, you know, they're free or they're very cheap. So that's why profits are going to plummet as automation enters the supply chain.
Interesting. And in terms of how organizations are addressing this, I think it's also interesting to note how you can almost divide the pool of resources into some certain scenarios. One is the resources that need to be trained for extra skill sets on how to manage the increased level of automation or robotics process automation or artificial intelligence that will come into play in the organization. And then there's others that would need to be redeployed within the organization elsewhere, overall increasing productivity in that way. And then there's the pool that where there's no opportunities identified, so they're not able to do increased levels of activity of services, and they're not in the pool of being able to be redeployed elsewhere. Your thoughts on that?
Right. It's an excellent point, Richard. And this was really why I wrote my book, A Radically Beneficial World, is what I was proposing was that there is a very large pool of workers who don't have the value system, the ambition, the sort of background, perhaps, to take on the extreme challenge of learning a bunch of high technology skill sets, right? And so, of those people, many of them have other kinds of intelligence. You know, in other words, we need to help people identify where their strengths are. And so, for instance, some people have great manual intelligence, right? They can work with um, uh, very fine machinery, some of which, of course, is related to robotics.
Now, so what can we do about this? Should governments take a role in redeploying or training resources affected by these changes? So that this would be the pool of resources that are unable to be redeployed within the organization, or that still continue to have an expanded role in their current positions and job functions. So, what can government do in this regard? Does it make sense to have government play a role? Your thoughts?
That's a great question, Richard. And I think we can discern two approaches here. One is direct government spending, like on infrastructure. A lot of people think of that. But it's also the government could streamline a lot of really clunky processes we have now in education, both lower level high school education and also higher education. So there's opportunities for the government to contribute to the solutions in two ways. Simplifying and enhancing processes that it's already involved in, and then direct spending.
Mm-hmm. And what about reliance on the invisible hand of Adam Smith? So, would that play a role here in terms of, resources able to sort of self-identify or self-train into other areas of the economy?
Right, it's a great question, and it's always an issue, I think, in a state market economy, which describes most of the global economy now, right? That the governments around the world are heavily engaged or involved in managing their private sector. And so a lot of people have a sort of quasi-religious belief that the market can solve everything. But there certainly seems to be examples in which government does need to play a role in terms of providing infrastructure for everybody, so that everybody has equal opportunity within a society. And it's something that isn't necessarily profitable for enterprises to supply those things. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, right? I mean, much of the canals and so on in the early the 18th century in America were privately funded. But to use the example you mentioned earlier, the Apollo mission to the moon, obviously there was no market demand for that. And so no one was going to put up money or capital because there was no profit to be earned and because there was no market.
Yeah.
And so in my book, A Radically Beneficial World, I talk about the community economy as a place where the government could redeploy capital, because it's not, there's a lot of work to be done in local communities, but they go in and do the work because it's just not profitable enough for them. But governments are often heavy-handed, and there a lot of the programs like job training end up failing. They don't produce the desired results. So that's kind of not a clear answer, but I think there's multiple levels of opportunity for government. Sometimes just providing some infrastructure, sometimes just smoothing the path so that private capital can get to work without a lot of red tape and regulation.
Yes. And what about the Lunar Apollo crash program back in the 1960s? There's estimates that perhaps somewhere between $4 and $8 in economic growth, economic activity was generated for every $1 invested into that program. So maybe could that be considered in terms of doing another crash type of program, but in something else that makes sense today, like nuclear fusion energy development coupled with electrification of cars, for example? Would that make sense and create jobs not only in white collar jobs, but also blue collar jobs across the entire nation?
Well, that's a great question, Richard. And I think a lot of people are looking to that idea as a major solution, right? A big government spending program on something that was particularly useful, which would be energy, right? Because we all know we need to transition away from fossil fuels. There's a cautionary part of that idea, and I look to Japan as an example of the cautionary part. Japan has spent almost 30 years spending a tremendous amount of fiscal stimulus on infrastructure, but what they've done is they've malinvested much of it in bridges to nowhere and highways that very few people use. And this is a result of their political system, which gives a lot of power to the construction industry. And so, sadly, in my view, they've squandered trillions of yen on infrastructure that really didn't serve the entire citizenry as well as if, say, they'd solarized their economy or done something that was more to the common good, instead of just kind of make-work projects. And so we have to be careful here that we're not just funding make-work jobs. We want to leverage some technology that benefits the greater good. And so one example a lot of people talk about is upgrading the electrical grid, because this is something that is required in order to make use of the electrical production from solar and wind. It's increasing, right? That the grid has to be completely upgraded. So that's an example of a program that sort of fits those parameters, that it would leverage government investment to the benefit of the private sector as well as to the citizenry. And of course, everybody loves the example of the ARPANET, which was the original little government-funded program that spawned the entire internet, right? That was a really low-cost investment. And so I think we can talk about that too. Like, it's easy to talk about spending $1 trillion, and everybody wants to spend $1 trillion, but maybe we should start by just trying to see what we could do with smaller sums to leverage new technologies and make them available to a wider range of people, like, say, 3D fabrication technology. That could be beneficial if the government invested in spreading that around, and that should be a lot less expensive than big $1 trillion programs.
Interesting. And finally, how do you see all of this playing out in the long term? Do you see like a combination of government taking a role, the invisible hand of Adam Smith, or potential crash programs in the future?
Right. It's a very dynamic situation, and I would hesitate to make any predictions, but I think that there's the potential for disruption is so large that the government itself should be disrupted. In other words, we need to disrupt to apply the technologies we were discussing. We need to apply them to lower the cost and increase the effectiveness of government itself. And so when we talk about government spending, one of the first places we should invest in is streamlining government, because it's really, in so many ways, it's really inefficient and ineffective, and it desperately needs to be disrupted and streamlined. So that might be a first place to start investing taxpayer money.
Wow, great insight as always, Charles. How can our listeners learn more about your work?
Yeah, please visit me at of2minds.com, and you can read samples of my most recent books.
Great. Thank you very much, Charles, for being on the program show, for your insights on this very interesting topic.
Oh, yeah. We barely touched the surface. Thank you so much for inviting me on the program.
The FRA Roundtable Insight Show is for informational and educational purposes only, and should not be considered as a solicitation or offer to purchase or sell any securities. The investments, investment strategies, and investment philosophies discussed or presented on the show each involve their own unique risk factors which are not discussed on the show. Any discussions among the panel participants or responses to listener inquiries are based on the personal opinions of the panel participants and do not take into consideration the listener's suitability, objectives, or risk tolerance. Please be advised that you invest or speculate at your own risk.